Ah, so this is how it ends, Odin thought to himself. His breathing measured, his eyes still closed. He could feel the sharp end of the wooden stake pressing into the skin of the left side of his chest, just above his heart, nearly breaking through now. It was straining and testing the amount of pressure the sharp object could press, until it managed to cause the skin to tear. The stake was being shoved with all the might in the universe that only the fiercest, most basic instinct could produce. Odin could crush this being into a million pieces. Odin could have stopped this before the first drop trickled from his skin and down his side. Odin slowly opened his eyes. Odin could not remember what his birth name had been. So much time had passed. His maker, who he now called his father, named him after the Norse gods, his name meaning wisdom, war, prophecy, victory, and death. Odin was not one of the reborn who loathed his lot in life. The minute he felt the burning pulsing through his veins, the searing pain of his heart bursting in his chest, his bones crushing into dust, his skin in flames, only to lose his human form, his mortal form, to become an unstoppable force. Feeling his ashes wheel around like the wind caught in a raging fire was indescribable. He was able to see as far back as time could possibly go. Back to the original maker, back to the one who created Eve to take from the body of Adam so that she may live, the original queen of those whose powers over man were to be feared and worshipped, the original queen, born from taking of the man his own rib and making it hers, making it her. He could see the stars being born and feel the heat. He felt the knowledge that all the earth held being pulled up into the ashes, swirling and swirling until he stood before his maker, naked and new, like a child comes into the earth. But he'd been reborn. He was a reborn. And with that power, he rode through the ages without fear. He'd been knighted and fought ruthlessly in the Crusades and every war since. He thrilled upon his power. He was graceful and handsome, blonde, muscular, ice blue eyes. He'd killed kings and became kings. He'd crossed the seas with the explorers and conquered lands. He'd taken a bite from every corner of the earth, and those that he'd bitten still coursed through his veins. He'd lived in villages with women taller than he, taking one after another as his bride. He had grasped every gold ring, partaken of the wine, the dancing, the food, and more women than he could count. In his time, he'd amassed massive amounts of gold, funded as many wars as he'd fought. More men, women, and children had been killed by him or because of him than there were stars in the sky. Centuries later, his maker came to him one day and told him that he must now stop acting as a selfish child and be the leader he had been selected to be. Not by might. That wasn't the way which was coming in the modern age. No, he must surround himself with the wisest of counsel, pull back into the world and become as much of a giver as he'd been a taker and partaker. He'd been placed in the House of Lords. Then, when he'd had to leave so that no one noticed that he didn't age, he'd managed to use his wealth in a way to pay homage to his maker, to make his father proud. Today he was Odin Marcus V. Of course, he was simply Odin, but there had to be a reason for the strong resemblances throughout history, his father had advised. He was what was called a philanthropist, which meant that he attended many parties and hosted many more charitable events. He lived in a mansion with 18 rooms, servants, and his father, the maker. He never lost his lust for war, but now he had to be a proper gentleman who hunted and played golf for sport. He had many lovers, but none that he ever wanted to be near for more than a few days. He was a serial killer who could not be caught. And for some strange reason, men are sometimes wont to confess to crimes they have not committed, which suited him and the maker well. He knew that one day he'd need a queen of his own, although his maker had told him long ago that children were not possible, and centuries had taught him that this was true. He laughed at the stories of the Reborn, called vampires, stories passed down about Prince Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler had been a mere man, and a crazy one at that. The maker had told stories of how he would not take Vlad's blood, but he used Vlad to impale the master's victims. Hide in the shadows, he would say. If possible, let someone take the glory or the terror. It is not yours to take. Yours is to be the leader of the man, to be better in all ways. We bow to our queen who first took of man, but she did not take the praise nor the glory. She hid. Even now that she has many princes, she hides. We must remember that. You must always remember that now. The world is a much smaller place now than when you were reborn. Everyone is connected in an instant. There's no room for mistakes. And Odin grew into his new role. He socialized with the men and women. He stayed in the shadows as one of them. In the winter of 2012, Odin was hosting his annual Christmas party in his home. The irony of celebrating Christmas after having loved many a druid woman was not lost on him, even now. He still kept a Yule log in his huge fireplace out of respect for those long-lost traditions. His home was sparkling with fairy lights at every turn. 5 Christmas trees, each designed to replicate the traditional trees he'd seen through the ages. He even specifically asked for one to have dripping candles on the branches, and ended up showing the professional decorator how to manage the request. The table was set with golden goblets and dinnerware, imported china, with hand-painted images of jolly Saint Nick, with his pack held over his back and stuffed with toys. Carolers were hired to sing in the background during dinner. Greenery made from fir trees laid over nearly every surface and wrapped around the grand staircase. The lights dimmed to allow the twinkling lights to take center stage. He wanted the scene to feel magical, and it was. As his guests came in, having been met at the end of his long drive by a horse and carriage, they were awed by the beauty and told him that he'd outdone himself again. And while he was greeting his guests, he spotted a caroler in her costume. She was wearing a deep red coat, tied tightly at her small waist, a bright green skirt peeking out from underneath, her hands in a white fur muff, black boots that hugged her calves, but still managed to show her delicate ankles, her red hair peeking out from a fur-lined hood, her eyes pale green, her lips with just a hint of red lipstick, a touch of mascara accentuating the longest eyelashes he'd ever seen, her cheeks naturally rosy, and on them sprinkled the perfect amount of freckles. Seeing her did not bring on the usual urges that he would feel. He neither wanted to bed her nor bite into what he could barely see of her pale neck. No, it was something that he couldn't stop thinking of for the entire evening and for 2 weeks after, until he finally called the decorator and tracked down the woman's phone number. For the first time that he could ever remember, Odin felt unnerved as he dialed the phone. When she picked up, "Hello, this is Eleanor." He felt a thrill rush through his body, through parts that he hadn't felt in centuries. His heart beating? He wondered, his mouth dry, his hands shaking. Odin of war, victory, and death was crumbling like a young schoolboy having his first crush. Odin and Eleanor, Ellie, began dating. Dating was something completely new to Odin, but he lavished her with gifts and trips, and one day, while standing where he'd stood many times before, at the Roman Colosseum, both in the ring as a gladiator and in the stands, cheering on the violent deaths while drinking wine and holding a woman on his knee, the same knee which he took in front of Ellie, and he reached for her hand, looking into her eyes, and asked her to be his wife. Ellie got down on her knees and held his face in hers while tears rolled down her cheeks, whispering, "Yes, yes, yes." One evening before their wedding, the Maker came to Odin and told him that it was imperative that he tell Ellie what he was, that he would not be aging and he would need to keep on the move, and that there'd be no children, that he had to give her the choice to embark on that life or not. And so he did. He took Ellie to a cafe, and as they sat on the patio, he took her hands and looked deeply into her eyes while telling her his story, how he needed to feed, how he'd lived, every part of what he'd partaken in, and spilling at her feet, how he'd never loved anyone but her. He watched as her eyes filled with tears, her long eyelashes trying to keep them from spilling down her rosy cheeks, her hands shaking, the wind blowing her red hair back from her face, and she stood up, walked out of the cafe, raised one delicate arm to wave for a taxi, and stepping in, didn't even look back at Odin as she left. 2 weeks passed, and though Odin had spent centuries of time on this earth, never, even once, feeling pain, these 2 weeks seemed to last 100 years for every hour spent awake, and the pain, which he could not quite locate, for it pulsed through his entire body and interrupted every thought, was unbearable. He went to the Maker and knelt before him, begging him to put him out of his misery. But the Maker would not. "My son, let her choose. If she does not choose this life, she is not strong enough to be your queen." But it was Odin that for the first time since being reborn, didn't feel strong enough. Then, at 2:45 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Odin's butler knocked on his massive wooden bedroom door. Odin told him to come in, and when he did, he brought with him Ellie. Odin and Ellie were married, and happily so, thought Odin. He knew that Ellie wanted badly to have children, and for that he ached. He adored her so much that he never suspected that she'd ever betray him in any manner. He ignored the master when he warned Odin that her longing for a child was strong within her. He understood that, but she began to volunteer at the hospital where he sat on the board. She'd been reading stories to the children in the cancer ward. One particular doctor, Michael Allen, had taken her under his wing, for which Odin was grateful, Ellie seemed fulfilled and content. One day, Ellie came home early from her volunteer work. There was a child she was particularly fond of, and he was going to pass. She begged Odin to save him, to ask the Maker to save him. "He can be ours," she cried to Odin. Odin did approach the Maker and was immediately admonished. "We do not turn the child into a reborn, Odin. That is a choice that a child cannot make for themselves. It is an abomination. It's punishable as the most offensive act by the original makers, by our Queen Eve. It's death to the reborn who takes a child, Odin. Hear me." And when Odin told Ellie, he saw her face harden. He saw her turn away and flinch when he touched her. He felt her heat become colder towards him, and his body ached with a pain so great that he didn't know how man lived through such things. 6 months later, Odin walked in on Ellie in their bedroom. Her back turned to him, her red hair flowing down her back, the front pulled back and pinned at the top of her head. He felt something from her, but he could not decipher what it was. This bothered Odin. Was he becoming weakened like man? But he reached out and touched her gently on the shoulder. She quickly turned, tears flowing down her cheeks, a wide smile on her face. She took his hand and placed it on her belly. "Odin, Odin, do you feel it?" she whispered and giggled. Odin did feel it. A human within a human, 2 heartbeats beating against each other. One Ellie's, which he knew as well as the back of his own hand. One, quicker, much quicker, and faint. He kept his hand there. "What is it, Ellie?" he asked. "Odin!" she laughed as she kissed him, holding his face in her hands. "It's our baby. We're having a baby." Odin's head was spinning. This was not possible. Odin would never be able to have children. Just not possible. Was repeating over and over in his head. But as he looked into her eyes, those beautiful pale green eyes, he believed that perhaps anything was possible with her, and he knelt down and he kissed her tummy. My love," he whispered. The Maker wouldn't speak with Odin about the news. Odin tried to insist that the Maker be happy, but the Maker was distant and cold. Odin pushed this out of his mind. He thought, why should I care what he thinks? I am Odin, the leader of men. When a beautiful baby girl with curly black hair and light green eyes was born, Odin held her and once again felt the pain rushing through his body, breaking through his heart and crushing it. Shattering it into a million pieces is what Odin was sure was happening. This small child with her mother's complexion was more than he thought his body could bear. "What should we name her?" asked Ellie, and Odin said, "Istra. It means spring and rebirth." Istra, Istra. I love it. And so here she was, Istra, his miracle. Istra grew to have long black curls that reached past her shoulders by the age of 2. Odin called her his raven for the color of that beautiful head of hair. Her eyes were the same color of green as her mother's, as she began to get tiny little freckles along her nose. Ellie was always pointing out Istra's features that looked the most like his, but Odin didn't notice anything other than those parts that resembled Ellie. He loved those parts more than he thought he could bear. Istra was quick to speak, and Odin thought much more intelligent than other 2-year-olds. Perhaps the brightest 2-year-old that he'd ever encountered. On a cold October night, Istra came down with a high fever. Her skin was wet with her sweat, her heart rate erratic, her breathing labored. Ellie rushed to call Dr. Allen to ask if he would come see her. Again, for only the second time in his life, Odin was afraid. So afraid that he couldn't bear to think of what would happen if there was something wrong with Istra. He knew that he'd want to die if he ever lost this child. Michael Allen showed up to Odin's home within the half an hour. His face flushed, true worry creeping up his face, his body tense, his black curly hair wet from sweat along his temples. His face, Istra's face, his hands, Istra's hands, not Odin's, as Ellie would tell him time and time again. He sank into a chair in the formal sitting room. The furniture in this room wasn't designed for comfort. In fact, it was designed to keep people up and moving around. And to him, it felt as though his body had just sat on a boulder. His bones were jolted. Fire was pulsing through his veins, burning his skin. His eyes became steely. He felt Odin, the Reborn, rising in him, first in his legs, which ached to be in battle, his arms pumping with adrenaline, wishing for the familiar weight of his sword, his chest broad and straining his shirt. Odin didn't know how long he'd been sitting in that chair when Michael Allen came to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. Odin could feel Michael's heart beating rapidly. Not the same type of fear he'd been feeling when he came through the door. No, this is the fear that Odin had smelled on man for centuries when they were in his presence. Odin, she's fine. I gave her an antibiotic and something for the fever. She's resting nicely now. Odin heard his words, but his heart didn't stir. His rage was too great, the betrayal too deep. The only thing he wanted to do was inflict as much pain as possible on Michael and Ellie. He turned his head towards the doctor and stood up to his full height, standing a good 3 inches over this man, this dog. His eyes bore into the man's own as he lifted his hand and touched the doctor's hair with the tips of his fingers. "Raven," he said, deeply in the back of his throat, barely containing his urge to tear this man's throat and gorge himself on his blood. No. Slowly, he changed his mind. Almost drain him, over and over, until he is merely the shell of a man, weak, but awake enough when he would run a needle-sharp fingernail slowly across the man's throat as he looked into his eyes while his soul escaped with a gasp. "Odin?" He heard Ellie's voice, and it snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked at the doctor and bent down to whisper into his ear, "Get out while you still can, son of man." Michael jerked his head back, and Odin could smell the sweet smell of his panic. He bet that he could even taste it on his skin by now. And Michael gathered his things and left. "Odin?" asked Ellie again. "Did Michael tell you the good news?" Odin looked at her, through her, her heart pumping blood so quickly. Her exterior looked calm, with a small smile gracing those beautiful lips. But inside, her pulse was racing, her heart trying to release itself from the confines of her chest. Her eyes were searching for his to meet hers, and when they did, Odin only felt burning rage. The betrayal. This disgusting, vile betrayal. He looked at that long neck, and he could see it pulsing. She knew, but she wasn't going to go first, or ever, if Odin didn't bring it up. Odin walked past her and into the girl's room. Her hair, his raven, his Istra, repulsed him to his core. She opened her eyes heavily and spoke. "Daddy, I'm feeling better," she said in her tiny voice that had always thrilled him, but now it felt as though someone was running their fingernails down a chalkboard right in his ears. A screeching, annoying sound. He managed to put out his hand, forced himself to put it on her head without crushing it in his grip, and patted her black curls. She reached out with her hands, Michael's hands, and he pretended that he hadn't noticed. He went to his room and laid down on his bed, somehow managing to fall asleep. As Odin opened his eyes, he met hers. They were wet and brimmed with red, her cheeks pale, her breathing heavy, her hair brushed away from her face, damp with her tears. He felt the sharp end of this wooden stake break through his skin. "Odin, my Odin, I have to protect her, Odin." And she was right. If Odin allowed his reflexes to respond, this woman would be dead before her body could hit the floor. Next would be the daughter of Michael, and finally, Michael himself. It would take days for Michael to go. He would take Istra quickly, in her sleep, to spare the child, but Michael would not be spared. Ellie was right. Odin closed his eyes slowly, feeling nothing. Not love, not regret, not fear, and said, "Do it now, or I'll kill you myself." With the power of a mother protecting her child, she shoved the wooden stake through Odin's chest, through his heart, her eyes flooding with tears, and the stake came out the backside of Odin's body before he burst and shattered into ash.
Hi everyone, make sure to subscribe to Exit Life and give this video a big thumbs up. And don't forget to share with all of your friends.